Tonight, I have a selection of horrific stories from Reddit. Could be true, maybe not. You'll never know. So settle in and welcome back to Morbid Whispers House of Dreams. My Uber driver took me to an abandoned building and followed me out of the car. By Vroshman. I work in food service, front of house. So, in the early days of the pandemic, with restaurants closed, I was taking work wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people, so I jumped at the opportunity right away. Ironically, the medical office job had been the safest gig I'd been offered thus far, COVID-wise. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could, due to crowds, so decided to swing for a rideshare app. It's not all that expensive in my area, and I really didn't want a virus. I headed in at almost 3 a.m., but it was after the cleaning crew had left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious, though, because I was so exhausted. I stumbled onto the block looking for my ride, and to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up asking, "Uber?" While I cluelessly wandered up and down the street searching. The ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I'm not familiar with all the surrounding areas and thought nothing of it. I was pretty alert at first, so was trying to pass the time playing games on my phone and stuff. But the car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one. So I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. I shut my phone down into airplane mode and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. I don't often take rideshare, so being alone with a strange driver often put me on edge, but this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look about him. He looked a little like my brother even. Young, clean-kept, listening to jazz, nothing that screamed, "You need to micromanage this trip." When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling me from the front, but I was in too deep a sleep and couldn't fully distinguish it from my dream. Finally, he awkwardly jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, ma'am, we're here now." I was embarrassed that I had been that out of it, so just gave a hurried "thanks" and booked it out of the car into the building. As I looked around, I began to realize nothing was what I had expected of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked up the business, and it had appeared to be a strip mall plaza. The further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. The structure was semi-dilapidated, and it was pitch black dark past the entryway. I expected some lights to be off in the nighttime, but not the whole building. I skittered across the concrete foundation comprising of what was left of the lobby area, told myself they must just be doing some renovations, and followed signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages but was likely just a few minutes, all I had passed was construction equipment. A couple locked doors and some smashed windows. I was certain I was not going to find a medical office and figured maybe I had mixed up the address. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around in the building, pacing, looking for a stronger signal. I eventually confirmed in my text that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try and get in touch with the driver, But if I entered the correct address, then it was only fair he should continue my ride to the correct place and save me the added fees of calling up a second trip, considering this was his mix-up. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one I had taken up, so would force me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit the situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building in the latest hours of the night, I figured the chances were high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past a tweaker, especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something so jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address and request to call 911 to help get me from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night and didn't have enough reception to call a new ride. But the message wasn't sending. Reception was too weak. So I gave up on getting my phone going and started checking for another stairwell, or even window with balconies or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort in the event whoever was downstairs came upstairs. I scrambled over to a door with a stairs sign on it, but the stairs were completely dilapidated and it was essentially just a straight drop down to the first floor. At that point, the worst-case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up the stairs. I thought fast and figured based on my walk about the floor was basically a giant loop, so I would have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint the opposite direction of wherever they were going and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road without encountering them. I was not anticipating being chased or anything, but didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there feel as though I'd trespassed and become hostile towards me, or have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to just 30 seconds. The person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, it was just the Uber driver. I figured he had come back for me, realizing he had left me in the wrong spot, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. So I came out from the beam I was hidden behind and started to wave him down. But then I processed. There was no way for him to realize that this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward and my blood chilled to slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly and he was completely calm and composed, but breathing pretty heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he might have returned. But in the moment, standing across from him, I just knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes. Operating solely on muscle memory and instinct, I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think he'd seen where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised but nothing was completely broken. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be the door, but it was too dark to tell. I was disoriented from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me knew it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, "There's another one of these guys. Ah!" and I stumbled backwards, trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could, a voice called out, "All right, this is the Michigan Police Department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such a fight or flight mode and had already committed to flight that I continued looking for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, "Hey, I said on the ground, right now, hands out where I can see them." He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did as he asked. He approached me and finally shined the light away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see he was really a police officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions, and that, combined with what had just happened, and my fear of the driver coming back, all snowballed into my being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He was even asking easy questions too, like, "Can you tell me your name? Do you have any knives, needles, or anything that could poke or cut me? Would you rather talk here or outside?" And my total stunned babbling in response at first led him to believe I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked the same questions again. The first thing I could think to ask was, "Did my friends call you? What did they tell you?" And he explained, no, nobody called him. He was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside of this building that's known to be condemned, and nobody's supposed to be inside. And when they are, they're not up to no good. He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up or meet a John, he had resources he could direct me to, and that this was not an ideal place to do either of those things, and asking if I had somewhere safe to stay the night. But I was stuck on something else he had said. Finally, it clicked. The car. I spilled my whole rideshare story in a frantic word vomit. He looked around and the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me all the details I remembered, and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much. But the officer realized I could pull up my Uber app and get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception there, even outdoors, so we sped down the road, and once I had enough bars, the app roared to life, and I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. They said, "Hello, I've arrived," and "I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct?" And "I'm flashing my hazards." And finally, "Unfortunately, your driver had to cancel." At first, I thought the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and canceling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off and exonerating himself. But instead, I checked the car details, checked again, and it was definitely not the same driver. The person who'd driven me there had not been my Uber. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this guy pulled up to me. The policeman took my statement and said they would keep an eye out for the guy, and the best I could give them to go off of was basically young-looking Caucasian man with brown hair, sideburns, goatee, and 4-door sedan, wearing a zip-up sweatshirt, maybe had a hood, which is like 1 out of every 4 guys in this city. I feel so blessed to have survived this near miss. Suffice it to say, I do not take rideshare services anymore. Quadruple check your license plate and driver name. You just never know. The time I was almost killed. and was robbed on a train through the Hungarian countryside by RPH Wrights. This is an old story, something that happened to me almost 20 years ago when I was 23. I was writing for a popular budget travel guidebook series and mainly worked in Central and Eastern Europe. Depending on the time of year and which issues were being updated, I could be gone for several weeks or even several months at the time. I mainly traveled alone. I ran into a few problems here and there, but my experiences were predominantly positive. I'd been working in the former Yugoslavia and was on my way to the Czech Republic from Sarajevo. It's a long journey by train, so I broke it up into several overnight stops. Zagreb at first, and then Budapest, making each leg around 8 hours. It was late January and bitter. There was probably a good 7 inches of snow on the ground, perhaps more in some places. I was exhausted and battling the remnants of the flu I'd picked up in Split. I left Zagreb in the late afternoon and expected to reach Budapest by around 10 p.m. I bought my ticket in the travel center at the Zagreb train station. When I boarded the car, about half the compartments were empty, but there were definitely other people in it. Since the train wasn't crowded, I managed to find a compartment to myself, so I spread out a bit and prepared for a long ride. The first part of the ride was smooth. I worked on some guidebook stuff, wrote in my journal, etc. However, a few hours into the ride, we passed over the Hungarian border and things started to go awry. I heard them before I saw them. They were a group of teen boys, about 5 of them that I could see, and they were loud. I could hear them running through the train car, laughing and cursing and banging on the compartment walls. They were loud and obnoxious, but it's not like the first time I'd been annoyed by a group of teenagers. I didn't look up, kept working on my writing, but as time went on, they grew louder and louder. As they ran from car to car, they slid the train doors open with so much force that it sounded like a bomb going off every few minutes. And then the sounds got louder. That's when I noticed they were standing outside my compartment, looking at me. I could see only 3 of them through the small window, but there were definitely more. I'd seen them earlier. I glanced up at them, frowned, and then looked away. I learned the best way to deal with that kind of thing was to ignore them. I didn't want to encourage their behavior, but ignoring them seemed to have the opposite effect. Girl, they hollered at me. Come have fun. My compartment door was closed, but they proceeded to mess with me, slowly opening it, pretending they were going to come in, and then shutting it again. It went from chanting, girl, to much more ominous, we're gonna fuck tonight, and you fuck us all, followed by a bunch of slang words for female body parts. Some of the more universal ones I had no trouble understanding. At this point, I grew very nervous. How was I to know whether they were just messing around with me or serious? I couldn't exactly leave. To do so would mean walking through them. They were blocking my exit and my entrance. And then one pulled out a pocket knife. He stuck out his tongue and ran the blade across it, and then pointed at me and grinned. The guy next to him made sexual hand gestures towards me and laughed. I tried not to show anything, but in my mind I was quickly taking stock of what items I absolutely had to take with me if I made a break for it. My lack of reaction angered the one with the knife, so he switched from licking it to using it to penetrate the circle he'd made with his thumb and forefinger. You like? He called out. You die. Part of me figured that they couldn't really do anything. There were other people in the train car, after all, and they'd hear me scream. Surely someone would come and help me, right? The conductor hadn't come through since we did the border crossing, so he was due for a trip as well. I figured I had only to get through the next few minutes and they'd get bored and leave. It was at this point that I noticed the curtain on the door window. I know it sounds crazy, but that's when I lost it. I'd left the curtain open so that people walking by could see the compartment was occupied. But now all I could think of is that if they came in, all they'd have to do was pull the curtain and nobody walking past would see what they were doing to me. At least one of them had a knife. They were all taller and bigger than me. I am 4'10" and weighed 98 pounds at the time, and they outnumbered me. I started to tear up. Would they kill me? Would I be seriously maimed? I was 23 years old, but a late bloomer. I also had a history of sexual assault. I'd only had consensual sex for the first time a year earlier. I feared rape more than death. I feared pain. My day pack was in my lap, and the only things I had in there for weapons were a fingernail file and a butter knife. I reached into my bag and fumbled around until I had one in each hand. But just as they slid the door open and the first guy stepped inside, a knife pointed at my crotch. Another voice filled the corridor. I didn't need to speak the language to hear the anger. The guys ran from my compartment, one dropping the knife, and I watched as a middle-aged man dressed in blue stomped after them. A few seconds later, the train came to a grinding stop. The world outside was creepy. All I could see was snow and blackness. There were no lights in sight, and after a few seconds the train started back again. The boys didn't return. I was just starting to feel some relief when the man in blue returned to my compartment. He was a conductor. "English?" he said, and I nodded. "I made them leave. They're gone." I thanked him, and he came into my compartment and sat down across from me. It felt good having another adult, a male, in there with me, especially an official one. I felt safer. "It's okay," he said again. "Gone." "Thank you," I replied again. I was scared. He nodded knowingly and then leaned back into the seat. "It happens," he said. "Sometimes we get this. They can't hurt." I honestly felt like I was going to pass out from emotional exhaustion. But just as I was starting to let my guard down, the conductor leaned forward again and said, "You need the fee." "Oh," I said. I produced my ticket and showed him. "Here's my ticket to Budapest." He looked at it, shrugged, and handed it back to me. "This is a ticket, yes, but there's a fee for Hungary. You didn't pay." This was the second time I'd made that route, and I'd never had to produce anything extra on the train itself. Now I started feeling sick to my stomach. "How much?" I asked. I had very little cash. I was planning on taking money from the ATM in Budapest. He quoted me a number that was around $50. For what it's worth, that's $10 more than what I had paid for the actual ticket. I knew he was taking advantage of me. I wanted to argue, but then he said, "If you don't pay, then you have to leave now." We were literally rolling through the blackest night I'd ever seen. The snow looked like it would come to my knees. I didn't want to be dumped in the Hungarian countryside like the boys who were harassing me. I felt like I didn't have a choice. "I don't have any Hungarian money," I said. "I've been in Croatia and Bosnia." He shrugged. "I will take." He waited while I rooted around in my backpack and produced $30 in a combination of Czech, Bosnian, Croatian, and Slovenian bills. I left myself $20. "I don't have enough," I said. He shrugged again. "It's okay. I'll take." With that, he took the wad of cash and stuffed it into his pocket. Then he left. Once he was gone, I gathered my day pack and headed to the bathroom. I had to pass by other compartments as I walked down the corridor, and it was at that moment I realized I'd been wrong. There were not other riders in the other compartments. They'd all left at some point. I was the only person in my car, And if the guys had come in and attacked me, then nobody would have heard me scream. I'd have been on my own. I cried for a solid 5 minutes into the tiny bathroom and then threw up into the metal sink. I never want to meet those guys or anyone like them again. And I could do without meeting the conductor as well. The Abandoned House by Positive Research 22. I just left the police station and told them what just happened, but more people need to know this. I was hitchhiking at a gas station. The time was around 10 p.m. A forest with very tall trees surrounded. The road and gas station are the only sign of civilization. I had been at the gas station for an hour at this point. Hardly any cars passed by in this time, so I figured I would be there for a while. After another half hour, I decided to go into the small diner in the gas station. When I entered, there was only one person there, but there was something off about this person. Their head was down, and I couldn't see their face, but I decided to overlook it for now and get some food. After I had my food, I went to the bathroom before attempting to hitchhike again, but when I got into the stall, I heard someone enter the bathroom behind me. As I finished and was about to leave the bathroom stall, I then heard a slow knock on the stall door. Knock, knock, knock. I asked who was there while looking at the large shadow and shoes that were under the stall door, but I got no answer from the man, but suddenly he left, and I was left confused by what happened. I decided to leave the bathroom stall, and I saw no one there, so I decided to just forget it and go back to the diner. I paid the check and left to buy snacks in the gas station and go back outside to hitchhike. I was outside trying to hitchhike for 22 minutes, and a truck driver approached me and said he was heading towards New York and asked if I was headed towards the same area. I was, so I decided to go with him, and we left the gas station. After 1.5 hours of silence, we were still in the forest, and I decided to make conversation as we hadn't for much of the trip so far, and I asked him, "What are you transporting?" But he told me not to worry about it. So I was a bit put off, but I figured I should try to forget it and try to get some sleep. I woke up and the time was 4 a.m. We had stopped and the driver was missing. Outside was so dark I couldn't see anything outside the truck, and outside the truck I heard whispers and then heard the truck cargo door slam shut. So I decided to go outside to see where the driver was. As I stepped out, I went towards the truck cargo doors, as I heard them slam shut just moments ago, so I figured he was there checking the cargo. When I got round there, the truck then started up again and began to drive away. I tried to chase it, and I shouted as loud as I could, but the driver didn't hear me. I was left alone in the dark. But at that moment the clouds cleared and a bright full moon lit up the ground, and I saw I was still in the forest, but there was something else there. A house. I saw a house in the moonlight, but it was abandoned and it looked like it had been for a very long time. I went to check inside my bag, but I realized I left it in the truck, and I only had my phone, and at the time I had no phone service, but of course I do now. I went towards the house and figured I should wait for morning, so I entered the house, and as soon as I did, I got this awful feeling like I was being watched. Little did I know at the time, I was. I decided to sleep for a while, but I couldn't for 45 minutes, and it was now almost 5 a.m., and I decided to look out the window since I couldn't sleep anyway, and then I saw it. Dozens of people staring at me wearing creepy masks that were highlighted in the dark from the moonlight. I was so scared I couldn't even react, so I went to look out a window on the other side of the house and saw these people surrounded the house I was in. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified, and then it got even more scary when I saw these people with masks in the trees too, making sure I didn't escape. The creepiest part is that I couldn't see their bodies, only their masks and nothing more. As I thought about what to do, I remembered I had seen the mask they wear before. At the diner, the creepy man that gave me a bad feeling had the mask laid down next to him. It all made sense now. The bathroom, the diner, and now. I was being stalked by a cult. The cult knew I couldn't do anything as I was surrounded. All I could do was wait, either for help or death. At 6 a.m., as the light from the sun slowly appeared in the sky, they made their move and came towards the house I was hiding in. Little did they know they made a mistake. They forgot about their last victim, a dead cult member. I found this cult member dead in the basement. I don't know why they killed their own cult member, but I figured he was a spy for another cult or betrayed the cult he was in, but they forgot to remove his uniform. I took his uniform off his lifeless body and put it on myself, so I could now blend in with the cult outside. The only problem now is how to leave the house, and that I figured out too. After watching the cult, I saw they move around every few minutes, which shifts their focus off the house where I was currently hiding. I waited to climb out the basement window and watch for them to move so I could leave, and eventually they did move, and I took my chance and I succeeded in escaping. I didn't know where I was going when I escaped, but I was going far from this cult, far from this house. Eventually, I got to a road and found help, and they took me to a police station. I just left 10 minutes ago and currently am sat on a bench outside the police station where I am telling you this story using free Wi-Fi. I need to warn you all never to hitchhike because even though I escaped, I fear one day they will be back for me. Could have gotten a degree in criminology at this rate by Mysterious Armoire. At the time of this story, I was 21 and living in a major Midwestern city, attending the university there. Having lived there for only 1 month before my story began, I had witnessed a train stop stabbing, been yelled at by a crackhead, had a homeless guy follow me and threaten to choke me outside the physics building on campus, and watched a 13-car cop raid on a drug house just across the street. The area around the university is known for being rough and has a notoriously high rate of crime. We would get a few texts a week from the campus police saying things like there had been a robbery, a break-in, an assault, stalkings, attempted kidnappings, etc. I always ignored these texts, thinking foolishly that I would never be a victim because I was smart enough to stay out of trouble. Not go out alone late at night, all the cliches. I seriously regret this behavior now. And to anyone listening to this, please never think that you're 100% safe, no matter your level of preparedness. Always do your best to stay observant and careful. The first incident wasn't too unusual. I was just a block or two from my apartment building one day in the early evening. It was still light outside. I was walking my dog, Sesame, a cute Shiba Inu who looks just like a fluffy, goofy puppy, and has never been frightening or particularly protective in his life. As I was headed back home, I passed a small parking lot, and in it a large van. As I was heading back home, I passed a small parking lot, and in it a large van. I could see a man in his early 60s sitting in the driver's seat, smoking a cigarette. He was staring at me. As I passed, he actually leaned out of his car and called out to me, "Hey, you there? That's a cute dog. What's his name?" I should mention this isn't even my first story like this. I have a pretty intense fear of strangers and particularly struggle with PTSD from other incidents in my life. Being pretty wary for this reason, I ignored him and just walked faster. I heard a car door shut behind me and turned quickly to see that he had gotten out of his van and was slowly walking towards me. He called out to me again, "Hey, baby, I just want to see your dog. Come back." His phrasing pissed me off, and I gripped the dog's leash and started to speed walk away from him, starting to feel nervous. My heart was beginning to pound, but I kept telling myself over and over that I was overreacting and it was just my paranoia acting up, and there was nothing to worry about. Boy, was I wrong. I managed to turn the corner and was about to cross the final park before getting to my apartment. In my fear over the van guy, I wasn't paying attention as much as I usually do to what was in front of me. I looked back over my shoulder and the guy had stopped following me. He was, however, standing in the middle of the sidewalk with a huge, creepy grin on his face. I whirled back around with my eyes glued to my building. I only needed to walk another half block before I'd be home. I was going to get away from him in his creepy van. Just when I thought I was safe, a group of 5 or 6 men came from the side of the park I wasn't watching. They were all tall and intimidating in stature, and all of them were laughing and looking right at me. Out of the corner of my eye, the van guy had started walking towards me as well. I remember he was whistling. I again picked up my pace and desperately searched for my keys in my pocket as I hurried to the door. The group of men then veered towards me, partially cutting me off, and in all my stupid politeness I stopped. They grinned at me with sick, perverted smiles, obviously checking me out, looking up and down my body. It made me sick. I tried not to panic and inched closer to my apartment. "Hey, what's your name? Where are you going? What's your Snapchat? Is that your apartment? Can we come over? Do you smoke?" They all barraged me with questions, one after another. I tried to refuse them, stammering, "No, thank you," as I saw the van guy come and join their group, leering at me. When I inched away, they inched closer. One of them then reached out for me, his finger actually touching my arm. I leapt back, trying not to start crying, but Sesame suddenly lunged at them, his teeth bared, a horrifying snarl ripping from his throat. Every bit of cute Shiba personality was gone, and he looked like he wanted to tear one of these guys' throats out. It startled them enough that I was able to turn and sprint the final distance to my building, locking the door behind me. I fell to the floor inside my building, hugging Sesame. However, the entire front of my building was glass, and to my horror and disbelief, the group of men came and stood in front of the windows, grinning at me, laughing, and making kissy faces and lewd gestures at me. The apartment manager came out and called the cops on them, but they ran away. I made it back home and scrubbed myself in the shower, crying and shaking with fear. Sesame got a special dinner that evening. I kept telling myself that they just wanted to mess with me, and I was never in any real danger. Stupid of me, I know now. About a month later, when I had finally managed to be able to walk outside my apartment without severe anxiety, I was actually planning on moving a bit further away from campus. It was still going to be in a sketchy neighborhood, but the thought of those men knowing where I lived kept me up at night. My apartment actually hired a security guard to be there 24/7 after someone had broken into the building, smashed all the windows, destroyed some of the furniture, and stolen a bunch of bikes. Of course, my bike got stolen. Anyways, I was heading home from class, and it was a beautiful day. I actually felt pretty happy for once, and popped my earbuds in on the last few blocks before I got home. Stupid. I know. After a block or so, I started to feel like someone was watching me. My palms started sweating. I glanced behind me, trying not to look obvious, and a tall man was about 20 feet behind me, staring straight at me. I snapped my head back around and ripped out my earbuds. No, 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 I thought. It can't be one of them. I was just jumping to conclusions, given my anxiety disorder and paranoia, surely. But there was something familiar about him. My heart was racing as I hoped to God the others weren't waiting for me around the corner of my building, ready to jump me. I walked faster, wishing Sesame was with me. I was too afraid to look back at him as I fumbled with my keys and wrenched the door open as hard as I could. This turned out to be a crucial mistake. As I ran to the elevator, trying to breathe a sigh of relief, I saw with absolute horror that the man had caught the door I had thrown wide open and was slowly coming into the building with me. He paused, standing away from me, but close enough that I could hear his ragged breath and smell alcohol coming off of him. My heart was thudding in my chest now, and I struggled to think clearly. The apartment manager was already home for the day, and I was completely alone in the lobby. There were no other doors out of that room, and the stranger was blocking my way to the door. The security guard, supposed to be keeping an eye on the building, was nowhere to be seen. The elevator came, and I tried to run into it and slammed my hand over the door close button as fast as I could. I pushed my floor button and huddled in the far corner of the elevator. I started to once again try to catch my breath, but right when the door was almost closed, he stuck his hand in. I couldn't believe it. He waited until the door was just about to close, then he stopped it. He was standing close enough that there was no way that was a mistake. My stomach dropped, and a suffocating sense of dread crept in. I kept my head down as he joined me. My desperate hope that he was just a dirty, drunken resident of the building was dashed when he didn't press any buttons. I don't know why I didn't run out of the elevator or try to leave the building again. I was paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was watch as the door closed and sealed my fate. The elevator was filled with the stench of alcohol and BO. If I wasn't so terrified, I may have gagged. It was nauseating. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't move. I tried to scream at myself in my head to press the wrong button and try to escape him, but I was completely petrified. He leaned closer to me, and I heard him breathe in deeply, a very quiet sigh, like he was content. I felt tears well in my eyes, and the seconds it took to reach the top floor where I lived felt like hours. I saw no way I could escape the sick, drunk guy who was smelling me. In the reflection of the elevator walls, I could make out his disgusting smile. He was staring directly at me, his hands in his pockets, clearly holding on to something. I'm not religious, but I prayed that I would make it to my door in time. I realized he probably wasn't going to attack me in the elevator. There was a large camera in the ceiling. I looked up at it, feeling a tear spill out of my eye as I did so, hoping that whoever saw the tape eventually would identify this man. The worst part of all of this is that I've trained in martial arts and self-defense since I was about 8 years old. I thought myself as stronger and braver than I was acting. I should know what to do. I should be strong enough to do it. But no matter how many times I had disarmed, thrown, or choked out attackers in the studio, nothing totally prepares you for the dread of real-life situation. As the elevator reached my floor, I managed to snap out of my stupor long enough to dash through the door and run to my apartment unit. I nearly missed the keyhole, but I threw open my door. I was nearly through when my backpack snagged on the handle of the door, trapping me. I heard the man walking quickly to my door, a low chuckle building in his throat as he watched me panic and struggle to get free. I felt like a mouse being watched by a cat, trapped and helpless, so close to escaping. I finally gave up and shoved my arms through the straps, abandoning my backpack. As I did so, the man suddenly reached out for me. I was able to slam the door shut, deadbolting it. The gust of air from the door slamming brought his disgusting smell in with me, and in my terror and disgust I retched violently. I looked through the peephole. He was staring right at me, pressing his forehead against the door, his mouth bent in a furious scowl. He swore at me and ripped my backpack off the handle of the door, slamming it to the ground. I winced as I heard my laptop thud. I was still too terrified to say anything, but I grabbed the knife I kept by my door in my hand, ready if he tried anything. After a few minutes of staring at my door, jiggling the handle, licking the peephole, and making obscene motions at it, he unzipped my backpack, dumping its contents on the floor. He picked up my bag, sniffing it and leering at the peephole as he did so, like he knew I was watching him. I couldn't look away, again paralyzed in fear. Finally, he left, using the elevator visible from my door like nothing had happened. I continued to stare out the peephole for what felt like an eternity, and then finally called the apartment manager, feeling my anger sinking in that the security guard hadn't been anywhere in sight, not paying attention. Turns out he had fallen asleep eating Taco Bell and was watching movies on his phone. He was only 10 feet away from the elevator the entire time, sleeping in the office behind a closed door. They fired him, but the creepy guy was never caught, and neither were any of the others. I don't even know for sure if this man was part of the original group. I was honestly too terrified to look much at their faces during the first incident. I moved out of my apartment a week later, staying with my boyfriend at the time for the remainder of my lease, and keeping Sesame with me at all times when possible. A few more things happened while I lived in that city, from having to call in a gunfight from outside my new apartment window, to having to pick up my friend who was being followed by a van, to having to evacuate during an arson incident. There are nice things about that city too, but during my time there, besides learning the police department was absolutely useless and corrupt, to nearly escaping with my life multiple times, I couldn't be happier to be far, far away from there and doing a lot better with my fear and anxiety. And now we have a short story from my friend Darwin's Barnacle 01. The Art of War. Every school day I would wait impatiently for that familiar ring of the bell, a high-pitched screech that would be irritating if it didn't signal home time. I used to cycle home so hard my thighs burned. The sooner I returned, the sooner I could turn on my console. I played only one game, Art of War. It's a series that's been out for a while now. A strategy-based game where the objective is to take out enemies, usually opposing armies. I enjoy it because it allows for so much creativity. Amateur players will go in gung-ho, calling in unnecessary airstrikes, whereas more sophisticated players will have a well-rounded, stealthy plan, the personification of the gray man approach. My excitement grew when I learned of the developers' intentions to offer professional contracts to the top 100 players, live streaming to huge audiences. I had a sort of not-so-friendly rivalry with a schoolmate, Anthony, to see who could make the cut. I managed to make it. In fact, we both did. I couldn't believe we were getting paid to do what we love. The rivalry continued as we made our way up the professional leaderboard. I always had one eye on who had the highest score and the biggest following. I tried my best, but he seemed to always have the edge. He wasn't afraid to flaunt it, taunting me. After a while, I'm a little ashamed to say I had a new strategy. When he went on for breaks or finished work, I would sneak into his office and sabotage his efforts. It started subtly, maybe using a plan that wasn't the best, but neither was it terrible. He didn't notice since I always went for small side missions. I chose from our quota of beta testing missions, which involved anonymity from viewers. None of this affected Anthony's score enough to make any real difference. So I decided to take it up a notch. I went for bust, sneaking in one day after work. One huge blow. No one would know it was me. I took control of his drones, ignoring the objective entirely. I took out several schools, a few hospitals, even a place of worship. Just as I was really getting carried away, our boss ran frantically into the room. He looked equal parts terrified and furious. That was the day I found out we weren't just playing a silly game. Our employer was actually the military, and we were playing for real. Well, did you make it to the end? I certainly hope you did. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing and hit that like button. It helps me out a lot. And I will see you next time in Morbid Whispers, House of Dreams.